They called him the Invisible Man. That wasn't his name, of course. His name was Samuel Harris. But in the sterile, white-walled universe of the Northwood University Physics Department, he might as well have been a ghost. He was the low hum of the floor polisher after midnight, the faint scent of ammonia in the morning, the silent shadow who emptied the trash cans filled with crumpled papers and discarded genius. And he was the only one who knew they were all wrong. The epicenter of their failure was a whiteboard that stretched across an entire wall of Lab 3. It was a chaotic masterpiece of numbers, symbols, and Greek letters, a battlefield of failed attempts. At its head, scrawled in angry red marker, was the name of the beast they were trying to slay, the Finch-Kessler equation for quantum gravitational decay. It was a problem that dealt with the death of stars, a mathematical map to predict the exact moment a celestial giant would collapse into a black hole. Dr. Alastair Finch, the man whose name was on the equation, a Nobel laureate with a mane of white hair and an ego as vast as the cosmos he studied, believed solving it would be his magnum opus. His legacy. Tonight, like every night for the past 6 months, he was failing. "It's the quantum spin," he boomed, his voice echoing in the cavernous lab. He jabbed a finger at a long, convoluted string of calculations. "We're misinterpreting the angular momentum. The decay is happening faster than the math allows." His two proteges, Dr. Kenji Tanaka and Dr. Lena Petrova, stood beside him like acolytes. Kenji, sharp and ambitious, nodded eagerly. "If we recalibrate the baseline, maybe account for dark matter interference." "We've tried that," Lena snapped, her tone brittle with exhaustion. She pushed her glasses up her nose, her eyes red-rimmed from staring at the board for days. "The interference is just noise. It complicates the model without solving the core paradox." Samuel stood by the door, his cart of cleaning supplies waiting patiently. He was there to clean the lab, but he always lingered for a few moments, listening. It was a quiet act of rebellion, a secret he kept for himself. They saw a janitor in a faded blue uniform, a man with calloused hands and a quiet demeanor. They never saw the mind behind the eyes, a mind that had once danced with these same numbers in lecture halls and libraries, long before life had forced him down a different path. He looked at the board, not at the chaos but at the space between the numbers. He could see the flaw as clearly as a crack in a window. It wasn't the spin, it wasn't dark matter, it was simpler, more elegant. It was a variable they had dismissed on the first day, a tiny, almost insignificant factor they'd called a rounding error. They were looking at the death of a star as a straight line, a beginning, a middle, an end. Samuel knew it wasn't a line, it was a circle, a loop. Lena let out a frustrated sigh and threw her marker onto the tray. "I'm done for tonight. We're just running in circles." The irony made Samuel's lips twitch into a faint, sad smile. Kenji glanced over and saw Samuel standing there. He nudged Lena. "Looks like the night shift is here to wipe away our failures." He said it loud enough for Samuel to hear, a casual cruelty that was part of the lab's atmosphere. Lena didn't even look at him. To her, he wasn't a person, he was a function. The man who made the room clean again for their important work tomorrow. Finch, lost in thought, took the eraser and, with a sigh of disgust, wiped a huge section of the board clean. "Fresh start in the morning," he muttered, though no one, least of all him, believed it would help. He turned and walked out, his proteges trailing behind him, their voices already rising in another tired argument. The lab door clicked shut, leaving Samuel alone in the silence. The room smelled of stale coffee, dry erase marker, and the electric hum of dormant machines. He walked slowly toward the vast, white expanse of the board. He saw their smudged failures, their brilliant dead ends. And in the clean, empty space Finch had just created, he saw the answer, glowing in his mind's eye, perfect and serene. He looked down at his hands, scarred, worn from years of holding mops and wrenches, not pens. In his worn leather bag, tucked beside his lunch, was an old, dog-eared copy of a mathematics textbook, a gift from his university professor from another life. The inscription was faded, but he knew it by heart, to Samuel, the finest mind I've ever had the honor to teach. Never let the world grind the numbers out of you. He had let it. He'd had no choice. But tonight, standing in the cathedral of their failure, something inside him stirred, a quiet defiance. He reached for the red marker Lena had discarded. Its tip was still slick with ink. He hesitated for only a second. Then, with a hand that did not tremble, he began to write. The mockery was never overt. It was 1,000 tiny paper cuts. A language of exclusion spoken in a dialect of sideways glances and dismissive tones. Samuel was the ghost in their machine, a presence they acknowledged only when he was in the way. A week earlier, the moment that solidified their blindness was still fresh in his mind. He had been polishing the floor of the main corridor, the buffer humming a steady rhythm against the linoleum. Finch and his team were walking back from the university provost's office, their faces a mixture of frustration and indignation. "He's threatening to pull the funding, Alastair," Lena was saying, her voice tight. "He said 6 months with no progress on the Finch-Kessler equation is unacceptable." "He's a bureaucrat," Finch scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "What does he know of theoretical physics? This isn't about building a better toaster. This is about understanding the very fabric of the universe." Kenji chimed in, his tone trying to match Finch's cavalier arrogance. "We just need a breakthrough, one variable, one new perspective." As they passed, Kenji's expensive leather briefcase swung out and knocked over a yellow wet floor sign Samuel had just placed. It clattered loudly on the polished surface. Kenji glanced down. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look at Samuel. He looked at the sign as if it had materialized out of thin air to inconvenience him. "Watch where you put that," he muttered, stepping over it. Samuel froze. The hum of the buffer seemed to fade into a ringing in his ears. He straightened up slowly, his knuckles white on the machine's handle. He said nothing. He simply met Kenji's eyes for a fleeting second. In that second, Kenji saw him, not as a man but as an obstacle, an annoyance. Finch and Lena hadn't even broken stride. It was in that moment Samuel knew they would never solve it. Not because they weren't brilliant, they were. But they lacked the one thing true discovery requires, humility. They were so convinced of their own towering intellect that they couldn't see the simple truth right in front of them. They couldn't see the variable they dismissed as noise because, in their world, anything that didn't fit their preconceived model was noise. Janitors, wet floor signs, unconventional data points. Later that night, cleaning their lab, he had overheard the conversation that confirmed it. "The decay isn't linear," Lena said, pacing in front of the whiteboard. "We know that. It's logarithmic. But the curve is off. It's like there's a feedback loop we're not accounting for." "A feedback loop," Kenji countered, erasing a string of symbols. That would imply the collapsing star is influencing its own gravitational field retroactively. It's a temporal paradox. It's messy. The solution has to be elegant. Samuel, emptying a trash can filled with coffee cups and takeout containers, paused. A feedback loop. Lena had been so close. She had touched the edge of the answer, but her own dogma, the academic obsession with elegance, pulled her back. They saw it as a paradox, a mess. Samuel saw it as the answer. He knew the decay wasn't influencing the past. The collapsing star was shedding mass in quantum packets that, for a nanosecond, existed in a state of superposition, creating a gravitational echo. It wasn't a paradox, it was a cycle. The star was feeding its own collapse. The math for it wasn't messy. It was breathtakingly simple if you knew where to look. It required a non-Euclidean geometric approach they hadn't even considered. They were using a hammer to fix a watch. He finished with the trash, his movements quiet and deliberate. As he left the lab, Lena looked up from the board, her eyes unfocused. "Did you get it all?" She asked, not to him, but to the space where he stood. "Yes, ma'am," he had replied, his voice soft. She didn't hear him. She had already turned back to the board, back to the problem she was too smart to solve. Samuel's apartment was a single room on the third floor of a walk-up, miles from the manicured lawns of the university. It was a space defined by order and quiet dignity. The single bed was always made, the small collection of books on the nightstand was perfectly aligned, and the air smelled of old paper and lemon-scented soap. This was his world. A universe away from the cosmic chaos he cleaned up after every night. On the wall above his small dining table hung a single, framed photograph. It was of a young woman with his eyes, her smile warm and full of life. His mother, Evelyn. Beside it was a smaller, faded photo of a man in a mechanic's uniform, his hands greasy but his grin proud. His father. His mother's illness had come on slowly, a creeping fog that stole her memories and then her strength. His father, a man whose heart was bigger than his paycheck, had worked himself into an early grave trying to keep up with the medical bills. And just like that, at 22 years old, Samuel Harris, the most promising mathematics student at Northwood University in a generation, was an orphan with a mountain of debt and a sacred duty. He dropped out of his PhD program a month before his dissertation was due. He sold his father's car. He took the first job he could find, then another. The world of abstract numbers and theoretical proofs faded, replaced by the stark, unforgiving arithmetic of survival. Rent, prescriptions, groceries, he didn't regret it. Not for a second. Caring for his mother in her final years was a privilege, an honor. He read to her from her favorite books, held her hand when she forgot his name, and promised her he was okay. But at night, in the quiet of this room, the ghost of the man he might have been would sometimes visit. It lived inside the worn textbook on his nightstand, Principles of Non-Euclidean Geometry by Dr. Eris Thorne. His old professor, the man who had seen the fire in his mind and had tried to protect it. He picked up the book now, its spine cracked, its pages soft as cloth. He opened it to the inside cover, to the inscription. Never let the world grind the numbers out of you. He had failed Dr. Thorne. He had failed himself. The fire hadn't gone out, but it had been banked, smothered under years of duty and exhaustion. He wasn't a mathematician anymore. He was a janitor, a good one. He took pride in his work in leaving a space better than he found it, but the work didn't feed his soul. It didn't make his mind sing. He traced the faded ink of the inscription with his thumb. Every night at the university, he stood on the other side of a glass wall. On one side, the brilliant, celebrated minds of his generation wrestled with the universe. On the other side was him, the invisible man who held the key but had no door to unlock. The humiliation wasn't in the mopping of floors. It was in the silence. It was in the knowledge that he was surrounded by a language he was fluent in, but was forbidden to speak. They saw his uniform, his calloused hands, the color of his skin, and they made their calculations. They filed him under irrelevant, another rounding error. He closed the book and placed it back on the nightstand, perfectly aligned. He looked at the photograph of his mother. He had made a promise to her, and he had made a promise to himself long ago. That night, standing in the lab, he had felt the weight of both. Perhaps it was time to keep one of them. The storm had been brewing for weeks, a low-pressure system of frayed nerves and intellectual desperation. That night, it finally broke. Samuel was cleaning the second-floor restroom when he heard the shouting echoing down the hall from Lab 3. It wasn't the usual hum of academic debate. This was raw, personal. He finished his work and wheeled his cart down the deserted corridor, the sound growing louder. He stopped just outside the lab's glass wall, hidden in the shadows. Inside, it was a scene of total collapse. Alastair Finch's face was a blotchy red, his white hair disheveled. He was pacing like a caged lion. Lena stood with her arms crossed, her expression a mask of cold fury. Kenji was caught between them, looking from one to the other, his usual ambition curdled into fear. "It's a dead end, Alastair." Lena's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "The entire premise is flawed. We're chasing a ghost because you refuse to admit your initial framework might be wrong." "My framework won a Nobel Prize," Finch roared, slamming his hand on a metal countertop. The sound reverberated through the lab. "My framework has been the bedrock of quantum astrophysics for 20 years. You think a postdoc who's been here for 3 years has the insight to dismantle it? It's not about dismantling it, it's about evolving it," she shot back. "The data from the new array doesn't fit. It consistently shows a pre-collapse echo, a gravitational ripple that precedes the event. Your equation can't account for that. It's instrument error, a calibration flaw." "It's not," Lena's voice cracked with a sob of pure frustration. "We've checked it 100 times. You just won't listen because the answer doesn't have your name on it." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Finch stared at her, his chest heaving. The great Dr. Alastair Finch, the man who spoke to the stars, was reduced to a petty, defensive old man, terrified of his own obsolescence. Kenji tried to intervene. Maybe if we approach the echo not as a product of the collapse, but as a catalyst." "Don't you dare patronize me with pop science platitudes, Kenji," Finch snarled, turning his fury on him. "You've brought nothing to this for months but sycophantic agreement. The both of you." He strode to the whiteboard, his shadow falling across the chaotic scrawl of numbers. He stared at it, his creation, his unsolvable masterpiece. For a moment, he looked utterly defeated. The fury drained out of him, replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness. He picked up the eraser. "It's over," he said, his voice quiet now, devoid of its usual booming authority. "The project is a failure." He began to erase the board. not with the targeted swipes of a scientist making a correction, but with broad, angry strokes of surrender. He wiped away months of work, entire constellations of thought, leaving behind a ghostly residue of his own genius. He didn't clear the whole board, just the central section, the heart of the equation, leaving a gaping, white wound. He threw the eraser down. It bounced off the tray and landed on the floor with a soft thud. "I'm done," he said to the room, but mostly to himself. He walked out without another word, not even looking at his shell-shocked Prete gaze. Lena watched him go, tears streaming down her face now. Kenji simply stared at the blank space on the board, his ambition extinguished. After a moment, they two filed out, leaving the lab in a state of wounded silence. The door clicked shut. Samuel remained in the shadows of the hallway. He had witnessed the death of an idea. He had seen a great mind break. He felt a pang of something that surprised him, pity. He pushed his cart into the lab. The room felt different. The usual tension was gone, replaced by the stillness of a battlefield after the fighting has stopped. He walked to the board, his eyes scanning the remnants of their work on the periphery. And then he looked at the clean, white space in the center. It wasn't a wound. It was an invitation, an opportunity. He reached into his bag and his fingers brushed against the worn spine of principles of non-Euclidean geometry. Dr. Thorne's voice echoed in his memory, a quiet whisper across 2 decades of silence. Never let the world grind the numbers out of you. He looked at the discarded red marker on the floor. He bent down, his joints creaking softly, and picked it up. He held it in his hand. It felt alien and familiar all at once. He walked to the board, stood before the blank space, and took a deep breath. The scent of stale coffee, defeat, and dry erase marker filled his lungs. And then, with the universe watching, he began to write. The squeak of the marker against the whiteboard was the only sound. It was a small, defiant noise in the echoing silence of the lab. Samuel's hand moved with a certainty that felt like coming home. The numbers didn't flow from his mind. They poured from a deeper place, a reservoir of knowledge that had been sealed off for 20 years. He didn't start where they had left off. He started from a place they had never thought to look. He drew a circle. Not a perfect, machine-drawn circle, but a freehand loop, elegant in its imperfection. Inside it, he wrote a single symbol, the symbol for a closed-loop integral. The foundation of his entire argument. They see a line, he thought, the marker flying across the board. They need to see a cycle. He began to build the proof. Each line of the equation was a sentence in a story he had been telling himself for months. He introduced the variable they had discarded, the gravitational echo. He didn't treat it as noise or a paradox. He treated it as a fundamental component of the system. He used non-Euclidean geometry to show that in the final moments of a star's life, space-time doesn't just warp, it folds. It creates a temporary recursive feedback loop. The equations were beautiful. They were a symphony. His hand moved faster, no longer just writing, but conducting. He connected their disparate, chaotic notes into a single, harmonious chord. He showed how the star's mass, as it decayed, didn't just vanish. It resonated, creating a ripple that reinforced the collapse, accelerating it in a final, catastrophic cascade. He worked without pausing, his mind alight. The janitor's uniform felt like a costume he was about to shed. The years of scrubbing floors, of being invisible, of swallowing his pride, they all melted away under the stark fluorescent lights of the lab. He wasn't Samuel Harris, the janitor. He was Samuel Harris, the mathematician, the man he was always meant to be. He filled the blank space Finch had created. Then he moved to the sides, his own elegant, flowing script weaving through their cramped, angry scrawls. He didn't erase their work. He absorbed it. He corrected it. He took their flawed sentences and turned them into poetry. He showed his work, every step, every logical leap. He made it so simple, so undeniably clear that even a bureaucrat with no knowledge of physics could follow the truth of it. An hour passed. Then, too, he didn't feel the time. He didn't feel the ache in his back or the fatigue in his legs. He was weightless, floating in a sea of pure logic. The universe was speaking through him, and for the first time in his adult life, he was speaking back. Finally, he wrote the last line of the proof. It was the answer to the Finch-Kessler equation. It wasn't just a number, it was a statement. A perfect, final, undeniable truth. Quod erat demonstrandum, what was to be shown. He stepped back from the board, his chest rising and falling heavily. He looked at the wall, now covered from end to end in a single, seamless mathematical tapestry. It was done. He felt a profound sense of release. A 20-year ache in his soul had finally been soothed. He calmly placed the cap back on the red marker. The small click echoed in the vast room. He set it down gently in the eraser tray. He looked around the lab at the dormant machines and the silent, watching computers. Then he turned, picked up his mop and bucket, and walked out of the lab, pushing his cart ahead of him. He finished his shift, cleaning the second and third floors with the same quiet diligence as always. He clocked out at 6 a.m., walked out into the cool morning air and went home, leaving behind a revolution on a whiteboard. Dr. Alastair Finch walked into Lab 3 at 8:02 a.m. He hadn't slept. His argument with Lena had replayed in his mind all night, her accusation, because the answer doesn't have your name on it, stinging more than he cared to admit. He felt old, tired, and irrelevant. He carried his briefcase in one hand and a large coffee in the other, ready for another day of banging his head against the same intellectual brick wall. He stopped just inside the doorway. He blinked. He looked at the whiteboard. His first thought was that it was a prank, someone from the engineering department maybe. They were always playing juvenile tricks. He took a sip of his coffee, a bitter taste filling his mouth, and stepped closer, ready to be annoyed. Then he actually saw it. His breath caught in his throat. The coffee cup trembled in his hand. It wasn't a prank, it wasn't chaos, it was order. It was a complete, systematic, and utterly breathtaking proof. It started with a closed-loop integral, an approach he had dismissed as unnecessarily complex months ago. It wove through tensor calculus and quantum mechanics with a fluidity he had only ever seen in textbooks written by the dead giants of physics. It didn't just solve the problem of the gravitational echo, it used the echo as the very foundation of the solution. He walked closer, his feet moving as if in a dream. His eyes scanned the equations, his Nobel-winning brain struggling to keep up with the sheer, blinding elegance of the logic. Every step was perfect. There were no wasted lines, no ambiguities. It was like reading a symphony. "My God," he whispered. The words were a prayer. He saw how the new proof incorporated his own work, his original framework, but corrected its fatal flaw. It didn't tear down his legacy, it completed it. It made it perfect, and at the bottom, in neat, confident letters, QED. He felt a wave of dizziness. He stumbled back and sank into a chair, his coffee forgotten on the counter. Who could have done this? No one at the university thought this way. This wasn't just a solution. This was a paradigm shift. This was the kind of work that would redefine the field for a century. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers shaking. He called Kenji. "Get to the lab, now." He hung up and called Lena. "I don't care what you're doing, get here." Kenji arrived first, breathless, his face etched with worry. "Alistair, what's wrong?" Finch didn't speak. He just pointed a trembling finger at the whiteboard. Kenji's eyes followed his gesture. He frowned in confusion. "What is wait?" His voice trailed off as he walked closer. His arrogant smirk, his default expression, dissolved. His mouth fell slightly open. "What is this?" "It's the answer," Finch said, his voice raspy. Lena burst in moments later, her face still stormy from the previous night's fight. "Alistair, if this is about last night, I'm not ready to." She stopped, her eyes landing on the board. The anger on her face evaporated, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. She walked toward it, her steps slow and reverent. She reached out a hand but stopped just short of touching the board, as if it were a sacred artifact. "The feedback loop," she breathed. "They used a non-Euclidean model. It's perfect." She turned to Finch, her eyes wide with a question that eclipsed all their previous arguments. "Who did this?" Finch finally found his voice. It was hoarse with a feeling he hadn't experienced in 30 years. "Aw, I have no idea," he said, "but we're about to find out." He stood up, his exhaustion replaced by a frantic, electric energy. "Get campus security on the phone. I want the surveillance footage from this lab, every second." From midnight until now. The three of them sat in the cramped security office in the basement of the physics building, huddled around a monitor. The security chief, a burly man named Gus, queued up the footage from Lab 3. "Here you go, Dr. Finch," Gus said, hitting play. Time stamped at 1047 p.m. The screen showed the lab empty and silent after their dramatic exit. For a long time, nothing happened. Finch, Lena, and Kenji watched, their nerves stretched taut. "Fast forward," Finch commanded. Gus skipped ahead. The timestamp read 11:15 p.m. The door to the lab opened. They leaned in. A man in a faded blue janitor's uniform pushed a cleaning cart into the room. It was Samuel. Kenji let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Oh, for God's sake, it's just the janitor. Skip ahead, Gus. This is wasting time." Finch silenced him with a sharp look. "Play it." They watched as Samuel moved through the lab with his usual quiet efficiency. He emptied the trash. He wiped down the countertops. He picked up the eraser Finch had thrown on the floor and placed it back in the tray. "See?" "Nothing," Kenji said, fidgeting. But Lena was silent. She was watching Samuel's face. There was a stillness about him, a focus they had never noticed. He wasn't just cleaning, he was observing. Then he stopped. He stood before the whiteboard, his back to the camera. He just stood there for a long, silent minute. The three physicists held their breath. He turned his head slightly, as if looking around to ensure he was alone. Then he bent down and picked up the red marker. A collective, inaudible gasp seemed to fill the tiny security office. "No," Kenji whispered, his voice laced with disbelief. "No, it can't be." But it was. They watched, utterly mesmerized, as the man they had never truly seen, the man they had ignored and casually mocked, walked to the board and began to write. The camera angle wasn't perfect, but they could see his hand moving, the equations appearing as if by magic. He moved with a grace and confidence that was utterly at odds with the stooped, invisible figure they knew. There was no hesitation, no second guessing, just a pure, uninterrupted flow of genius. Lena's hand went to her mouth. She was watching a master at work. The kind of intuitive, elegant mind she had only ever read about, and he was their janitor. The weight of her own arrogance, of her own blindness, hit her with the force of a physical blow. She felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. Kenji was pale. He remembered the wet floor sign. He remembered his casual, cruel remarks. "Looks like the night shift is here to wipe away our failures." The words echoed in his head, mocking him now. Samuel hadn't just wiped them away. He had solved them. Finch said nothing. He was transfixed. He was watching the birth of a legend on a grainy security feed. The shame came later. First, there was only the pure, unadulterated awe of one great mind recognizing another. He, the Nobel laureate, had been stumped for months, trapped by his own ego. And this man, this quiet, humble man, had walked in and unlocked the universe in a single night. The footage played on. They watched him write the final QED. They watched him put the cap on the marker. They watched him turn, pick up his mop, and walk out of the lab as if he had done nothing more than take out the trash. The timestamp read 2:38 a.m. Gus stopped the footage. The screen went black. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the sound of three brilliant worlds being irrevocably shattered and rebuilt. Kenji finally broke it, his voice barely a whisper. Who is he?" Finch stood up slowly, his face a mask of grim determination. "His name," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of their collective failure, "is Samuel Harris. And I think it's time we introduced ourselves." They found him in the East Wing corridor, on his hands and knees, scrubbing a stubborn scuff mark from the floor. The contrast was so stark, so brutally humbling, it stole the air from their lungs. The man who had mapped the death of a star was cleaning a hallway. Samuel heard their footsteps and looked up. He saw the three of them standing there, Dr. Finch, Dr. Tanaka, Dr. Petrova. Their faces were stripped bare of all their usual arrogance. They looked lost. He slowly got to his feet, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. "Dr. Finch," he said, his voice even. He nodded politely to the others. "Ma'am, sir." Finch took a step forward. He opened his mouth, but for the first time in his life, the words failed him. What could he say? He, the great orator of physics, the man who could explain the cosmos, had no language for this. It was Lena who spoke first. Her voice was small, fragile. "Mr. Harris," she began, then stopped, correcting herself. "Samuel, the whiteboard, in Lab 3, Samuel's expression didn't change. He simply looked at her, his eyes calm and knowing. "I hope I didn't overstep." The quiet dignity of his response was another blow. Kenji flinched, the memory of his own dismissiveness replaying in his mind. He stepped forward, his head bowed. "Overstep." Kenji's voice was thick with shame. I was an arrogant fool. The way I treated you, there is no excuse. I am so sorry." The apology wasn't for show. It was a raw, painful confession. Samuel looked at him, and for the first time a flicker of emotion crossed his face. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to understanding. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Finch finally found his voice. It was hoarse. "We saw the security footage," he said. He looked at the rag in Samuel's hand, then back to his eyes. "The proof. It was the most elegant piece of mathematics I have ever seen in my life. He paused, swallowing his pride. It was a bitter pill. It was a work of art. He took another step closer. I have to ask, who are you? Samuel looked past him, down the long, empty corridor he was paid to keep clean. I was a PhD candidate, he said softly. Here, 20 years ago, my focus was non-Euclidean geometry and its application in quantum mechanics. Lena gasped. Your professor, was it Dr. Thorne? It was, Samuel confirmed. Thorne's prodigy, Lena whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. He used to talk about a student he lost, a mind like no other. We all thought it was just a story. My mother got sick, Samuel said simply, the 2 decades of sacrifice contained in those 4 words. I had to stop. The 3 of them stood in silence, the weight of his story settling upon them. They hadn't just misjudged a janitor, they had been blind to a giant who walked among them. Finch's face was a ruin of regret and dawning purpose. He knew what he had to do. It wasn't just about an apology. It was about correcting a cosmic injustice. Mr. Harris, he said, his voice regaining its familiar boom, but this time it was infused not with arrogance, but with a fervent, desperate respect. This university and I personally have failed you. We looked, but we did not see. That ends today. He turned to Kenji and Lena. Get the provost, get the dean of sciences. Tell them to meet us in lab 3 in 10 minutes. Tell them it's an emergency. Then he turned back to Samuel. His eyes, for the first time, were filled with a profound and genuine humility. Come with us, he said. It wasn't an order, it was a plea. Please, your work is not finished. When Samuel walked back into Lab 3, it was not as a janitor. He walked in with Dr. Finch at his side. The provost and the dean were already there, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. Kenji and Lena stood by the whiteboard, looking at the symphony of numbers with reverence. Alistair, what is this about? The dean asked, his eyes on the board. What is all this? Finch gestured to the equations that covered the wall. That, he said, his voice ringing with conviction, is the solution to the Finch-Kessler equation. It will change the field of astrophysics forever. The dean and provost stared, impressed but still confused, and the provost prompted. Who solved it? Was it you, Alistair? Finch shook his head. He turned and looked directly at Samuel. No, he said, his voice clear and unwavering for all to hear. It was him, Mr. Samuel Harris. A stunned silence fell over the room. The dean and the provost looked from the Nobel laureate to the man in the janitor's uniform, their minds unable to bridge the gap. Finch didn't give them time to process. He told them the whole story. He told them about Samuel's past, about Dr. Thorne, about the years of sacrifice. He told them about their own blindness, their own inexcusable arrogance. He spared no one, least of all himself. When he was finished, the room was quiet. The provost, a woman known for her tough, no-nonsense demeanor, looked at Samuel, her eyes glistening. Finch walked over to Samuel. He stood before him, not as a superior, but as a peer. Mr. Harris, he said, I have a proposal. It is not an apology, because no apology would suffice. It is a correction, an attempt to balance an equation that has been wrong for far too long. He took a deep breath. On behalf of Northwood University, I would like to offer you a full research professorship, effective immediately. We will fund your PhD completion, and you will lead the new Center for Gravitational Studies. This will be your lab. We would be honored. I would be honored to work for you. Samuel looked at him. He looked at the whiteboard, his work, his soul, laid bare for all to see. He looked at Kenji and Lena, who watched him with expressions of profound respect. He thought of his mother and of the promise he'd kept. He thought of Dr. Thorne and the promise he was about to fulfill. A slow smile spread across his face. It was the first time any of them had ever seen him truly smile. It was a smile that held 20 years of pain and a future as bright as the stars he was finally free to study. Some victories are quiet. They happen in deserted hallways and empty labs, written in the silent language of numbers. And some people don't need to shout to be heard. They just need a whiteboard, a marker, and a universe that's been waiting patiently for them to speak.